Well, the Democratic Alliance's policy conference has decided not to include the word race in its policies around redress. The party says it will reject the use of race to categorize and treat people, particularly in legislation. To wade through some of these matters, I'm joined by Christi van Westhuizen, who is an associate professor at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at the Nelson Mandela University. Terry Oakley-Smith of Diversi-T also joins us for this conversation. Christi, perhaps let me begin with you. What do you make of the decision taken by the DA over the weekend?
Thanks, Cathy. Good to be with you and your viewers. What we've seen now over this weekend is basically a culmination of ideological battles that have been going on in the DA now for a number of years, going back to 2012, for example, when the Employment Equity Amendment Bill was before Parliament, and there was a major fallout at that point in time around black DA members in Parliament supporting the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, and then a decision being taken by other party structures not to support the bill, and particularly Helen Zille actually quite a heavy-handed way intervening there and ensuring that the DA caucus votes in a certain kind of way. And it's a contestation around whether one should use race as a proxy for disadvantage. And this battle has been going on, and then last year Mmusi Maimane actually managed to get redress as one of the pillars of DA policy, and not only that, also to get the DA to agree that race will be used as a proxy for disadvantage. And then with the poorer than expected election results last year, that was then used as an opportunity to move against him, and as we know, he's been jettisoned from the party. And the grouping that then took hold of the party last year has now, in a sense, tasted victory over this weekend by being able to insist on race being completely excluded. And in fact, I mean, I had a look at some of what was decided, and they actually make a nonsense of terms like diversity and redress. Those terms become completely nonsensical.
Terry, let me bring you into this conversation here. Can one have an honest conversation about addressing racism or even redress without using race as a category at all?
Well, I agree with Christi. I would think it would be completely nonsensical. I mean, I'm not a political analyst, but I'm an anti-racism and diversity activist. And I mean, I just can't begin to think of how one can discuss diversity, especially in a South African context, without discussing race. I mean, some of the things that come out of the conference are really quite absurd. They talk primarily about a diversity of thought, a diversity of talent, a diversity of knowledge. And yes, all of those things have to do with diversity. But unless we deal with the fundamentals, and in South Africa and at this moment, unless we deal head first with race, we're not going to make any progress at all in terms of redress. I mean, they also go on, Cathy, to talk about each individual is presented with choices and a reasonable ability to act on them. Now tell me, if you're living in Orange Farm, I would imagine those choices must be very different from the choices that are offered to somebody in Sandton, and we're deluding ourselves if we don't believe they have to do with race.
Christi, I want to bring you in here on this point that Terry has raised, because John Steenhuisen basically says, when you say you don't necessarily categorize according to race, effectively, by virtue of the broad-based policies that you'll be implementing, you'll be targeting and reaching the majority of South Africans who've been left out of the economy. Is that true?
I think that you do have to bring in race as one of your criteria, because I also think that one should bring in other indicators. And we already do that in government policy. For example, in the higher education sector, a lot of the decisions that are made around student funding include other questions like level of income and so forth. So I think it's good to, one can bring in a number of indicators, but race for me still needs to be one of those indicators for the simple reason that there's a major overlap between race and class in our country. So if we look at the vast majority of poor people are black. And the reason why the vast majority of poor people are black is because of colonialism and apartheid and the systematic dispossession that took place there and exploitation of black people. And that's what we're trying to redress, and that is why you have to bring race in.
Terry, because you do a lot of work in the space, what often becomes the reasons for organizations and individuals and their difficulty or inability to address and tackle issues of race head on and call race for what it is and address it as its own category?
Do you know, it's so interesting that even this sort of 26 years post our democracy, white South Africans find it extremely difficult to talk about race. They even find it difficult sometimes to use words like black. And frankly, until we can actually have real and honest conversations about race and about the differences of race, we're not going to be able to make progress in South Africa. I mean, it seems to me that the DA is sort of bending over backwards not to talk about race, talking about individuals being unique and not race or gender envoys, which sounds a bit like something out of Star Trek. But, I mean, we know that. But if I see somebody coming down the street towards me, or somebody comes into my workshop, obviously one of the first things I'm going to notice about them is their race. I'm going to notice their gender and various other indicators that Christi alluded to, for example, their age. But to pretend that we're not going to see race is really absurd, Cathy.
So, Terry, what is it then that would be needed, that would show South Africans that the DA is really having an honest conversation about race? Because they say that they have been having those conversations and that these decisions have been approved even by some who are within the party and are black members, and therefore they don't understand what the rest of the country perhaps may be going on about.
You know, I think, having not been party to these discussions, it's really difficult to state unequivocally. But there's a lot of a sense that there's internalized oppression among many of the black people that we deal with in our work, where the majority or the most powerful are white, will feel the need to agree with them and find it very difficult, quite honestly, to be able to put forward their points of view. And where white hegemony is still at the forefront, I think it's very difficult often for black people to really speak out and have a say. And unless you create an environment in which people can do that, and I would imagine that was extraordinarily difficult in these days with Zoom and so on. I really can't imagine how black people felt able to really engage with such a topic. I mean, how can a black South African feel that it's okay not to use race as an indicator? I just find it very difficult to understand that. And there's a kind of underlying dishonesty in suggesting that to us as South Africans.
Christi, I want to bring you back into the conversation here and perhaps pick up on this idea of white hegemony that Terry has touched on. What are your reflections on that? And do you think that fundamentally there would be perhaps little space for black people within the organization to be unable to freely express their views? Even though we do have the likes of Gwen Ngwenya, who is the head of policy, who is a black female.
Well, indications are that if you're a black person in the DA and you believe that race is actually important if you want to try and understand inequality in South Africa, then you will be sidelined. And we've actually seen that, starting with Lindiwe Mazibuko, then of course Maimane last year. We've seen also now at the time of this particular policy conference also what I find quite an odd timing, certain media leaks happening, and it seems like there's some plans to move against Phumzile Van Dam. Now, Phumzile is also one of the best young politicians. The fact that there's this move happening is very, very worrying, and you're starting to see a bit of a pattern. So if you're a black person who comes with a critical race viewpoint, you basically will find yourself marginalized, if not eventually ejected. And I think that's very worrying. It seems to me that the DA is absolutely intent on becoming a white minority party again, like they were back in the 1990s.